Colorado study finds that Second Amendment sanctuary counties don't use red flag laws as often as other counties. And new numbers show that gun sales are down for the third consecutive month. All this and more on the Reload News Update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Reload News Update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host, Reload founder Stephen Gutowski, founder of the Reload.com, where you can head on over and stay up to date on all things guns in America by signing up for our free newsletter. It goes out every week with a nice roundup of the stories going on in America. And speaking of the newsletter, we're going to jump into our first link there. It comes to us from Capital Weekly. It's an interesting story about California's so-called assault weapon ban. They've got the longest standing assault weapon ban in the nation. And this is sort of a journalist sort of journey navigating the thorny political divisiveness over California's assault weapon. And he wanted to investigate for himself whether or not it's a substantive ban or whether it's more symbolic. And he had some interesting results. He actually went and shot a bunch of guns. And you thought it was an interesting piece, right, Stephen?
Yeah, I thought this was a great piece of journalism. This is very encouraging. This is what people would call a long form journalism, shoe leather journalism, if you might. Essentially he went out and actually investigated this concept of as somebody who isn't necessarily up on firearms or doesn't know them intimately or hasn't spent a career reporting on them or whatever. He decided that it would be a good idea to go and actually try and experience these different firearms and look at this law, the specific law in particular, and its impacts, and whether it makes the kind of differences that proponents claim it does. And so I just think that's a fantastic approach. And he spoke with advocates on either side of the issue. He spoke with politicians who've supported the California assault weapons ban. And I just thought he did a really good job. It's an experiential piece. It's like a feature essentially where he's going through and spending time shooting different versions of the AR-15, ones that are compliant with California's ever evolving assault weapons ban, and ones that are available everywhere else in the country for the most part. And then also an actual full auto M4 too. He tried that out, and it was interesting to read through that and watch him go through the process and his observations as someone who's something of a novice on the topic, but who's trying to inform himself, right? Not that all of his conclusions come down in one camp or the other, which is probably what you should probably expect if somebody was really actually going into this without trying to come out with a specific outcome. So, he and I think he largely found that the assault weapon ban policy was kind of irrelevant to the actual firearms that he shot in the end, which is an interesting conclusion. I mean, this is a common critique, right, that you hear of assault weapons bans, that they go after essentially either cosmetic or ergonomic features, things like pistol braces, not pistol braces, although that's another controversy, pistol grips and, telescoping stocks, things that are, or barrel shrouds, things that are kind of ergonomic / cosmetic to some degree, at least. Bayonet lugs, right? That's mostly a cosmetic thing. Even though it has a function, nobody really uses it for the function. I thought it was a good piece. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile for people who are either super informed on this issue or they're similar to this reporter that went into this, don't know much about it. I think either way, you get some value out of it because it is someone that clearly doesn't really know much. He's obviously very aware of the political climate around the debate over assault weapons, for example. And he mentions Gavin Newsom's call for a new amendment to help enshrine gun control at the federal constitutional level. Right. But to actually see him go through this journey, this process of shooting these different guns that he heard so much about, I think is worthwhile. And just on the point about the features, I think in particular, he he made some interesting comments shooting the guns about ergonomically specifically. So he shot a California compliant one and made a remark about how he couldn't adjust the stock to help fit him better. He said this reporter had more trouble shooting the California compliance. So it's just funny to see someone actually have to navigate this in practical terms, what these restrictions actually do.
Yeah. And I think that's another point about often it gets just an aside really, but often the complaint is that these are cosmetic features, but they're really, many of them are ergonomic features. Like telescoping stock might not make a gun any more lethal, but it does make it so that different shooters can comfortably and accurately fire the gun, which is a kind of a strange thing to want to reduce in a firearm, right? I mean, that's sort of gets to one of the odd sections of the gunfight in the United States is like a lot of gun control measures just kind of make guns worse to some, not necessarily. I mean, I suppose in theory, if it's harder to shoot the gun, it would be harder to use just in anything, including crime, perhaps. But it's a bit of an odd thing for the effect of your regulation to be that the product is harder to use and hard to use properly. That's kind of what you get from these California compliant type guns is they're the same. Like he points out in the piece, they fire the same rounds, they fire at the same rate, they fire. Everything is basically the same about the function of the firearm itself, but they're just kind of more uncomfortable to handle. So anyway, it's a good piece, and I thought it was interesting to see the runaround he got from people like Governor Newsom, whose office kept sending him to a different place and then telling him that, oh, well, we're actually too busy to do an interview with you by the end of it. So some of them, he did get a couple of California Democrats to speak to him on the issue. I thought that part was just kind of, they just repeated some platitudes, nothing terribly insightful from the politicians' interviews, but the rest of it, his experience was interesting. And I think, like you said, valuable to anyone in this space, just to see somebody go through the process and read their observations from, a sort of novice point of view.
Sure. Yeah. And listeners should definitely go check that piece out in the newsletter link. The next story we're going to talk about comes to us from Politico, and it's a little bit of an update on sort of the political gamesmanship going on in Massachusetts over there. It was sort of touted as a Bruen-response bill, but it ended up being sort of an omnibus gun control bill that then was too controversial for the Senate. The House introduced it previously last year, and they have different versions, and they're trying to go back to the drawing board and hash them out. But this piece specifically deals with the way they're going about doing that, because I guess at first they promised open transparency, the public could participate in how they're negotiating. And then at the last minute, they sort of decided, actually, we're going to do it all completely behind closed doors because of quote unquote safety concerns.
Yeah. It's for everyone's safety that nobody gets to hear what they're saying when they try to work out the details of this bill, for sure. Look, I'm sure that legislators get threats like the ones they're describing in this piece. That's undoubted. It's obviously wrong to threaten legislators over legislation that they're considering. They're specifically blaming like neo-Nazis for this, which, I'm sure there are violent neo-Nazis that threaten legislators, but I'm also relatively sure that I'm pretty confident that they're not a very large group, and that the Massachusetts legislature ought to be able to provide security for its operations from a small group of neo-Nazis. So, using that as an excuse not to be public with these hearings, not to be transparent, to do it all behind closed doors, which, to be fair, is how they normally do this, apparently.
Yeah.
So, just to be, they're not necessarily changed, but they had themselves said they were going to do this in the open, in public. And to be honest with you, from my point of view, I think they're more doing this because of the other concern that's mentioned in the Politico article, which is that things that are said during this negotiation session between the House and Senate could end up in lawsuits against this coming gun control bill, because that's absolutely happened in other states. New York, for instance, the governor's comments. Now, that wasn't during a legislative session. She just went out and said this in public, but their Bruen-response bill, where they greatly restricted concealed carry after the Supreme Court said that they had to start issuing permits. She said, "Oh, it's going to be illegal. The only place it'll be legal to carry are on some sidewalks." And, pretty much getting straight into the intent of Bruen, at least, while, trying to dance around the specific ruling itself, which is what all these Bruen-response bills are doing. So, I don't, how much it's going to matter in the end, I don't know, because what they produce will be what actually matters in court more than legislative, comments during the debate in the legislature. But it's still, you look at the story and the situation, and I think that's a much more realistic reason why this is not taking place in public view.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, but I think it leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, especially because, like you said, they promised transparency in the negotiation, and people might recall what preceded this bill even being introduced in the first place was a quote unquote listening tour, where this particular legislator that wanted to introduce this big gun control bill actually went county to county to get public feedback on what the public valued in a bill. So it was all this long track record of wanting public involvement, public engagement, transparency, and then actually we change our mind. It's going behind closed doors. So
yeah, I guess the listening portion
funny.
Is over.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
It's still remarkable that they haven't gotten this bill through yet, though. That's right. Another interesting, and that they have to do this, that they're going back to a behind the closed door thing in a place like Massachusetts, right? This is not. Yeah. This is not a purple state. This is a deep blue state. This is one of the states directly affected by Bruen. There are only like 8 of them, right? And they still haven't managed to get their Bruen-response bill through. I think we all expect that they will at some point, but you did a great job of analyzing what was in the previous bill, and it was very expansive, even more so than the California or New York bills have been. And so I'm guessing that's really more of why they want to go even harder than the other states have, and assume. And if you look at one of the reasons to keep this behind closed door, I assume some legislators there are like, well, we don't want to immediately lose in court. Maybe there is some actual concern over how this will play out in the court system if they go too far. But it is remarkable that they haven't gotten through. It's surprising to me when you've got like Colorado and Washington, who have retreated quite a lot from passing one of these Bruen-response bills, but they still seem like they're still on board to pass something before Massachusetts does. Now it's much watered down from what I assume Massachusetts will eventually have. But it's just an interesting thing to see how they've struggled compared to California or even Maryland or New Jersey or any of these other states that have Hawaii that have actually passed their Bruen-response bills. So I guess we'll keep an eye on it, right? Because who knows what could come of it.
Yeah, we'll certainly stay on top of it as this negotiation develops. The last outside story we want to talk about today comes to us from the AP, and it's a new poll that they did with the National Opinion Research Center out of Chicago. And it's not totally about guns, but guns played a part because they were asking Americans what values they see as core to the U.S. identity. So things like, freedom of speech, the right to vote. They all got broad majoritarian support. And then at the very bottom, the right to keep and bear arms, which also got majoritarian support, but was there was the least unanimity on that one, which I think is telling about the sort of moment we're in politically over guns. where still it's noteworthy to see that, 54% it was extremely important, but 24% said somewhat important and 22% said not too important. So you still get strong support for the right, but it's far more divided than those other rights.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you definitely see, I think the biggest takeaway for me, like the first thing that I take from it is just the broad support. I mean, that's still 77%, I think it was.
Yeah, 78.
Yeah, that put it as an important right. And then I would look to it's still up there with these other issues as very important, but it is, like you mentioned, the other big takeaway is that it's the most controversial of them. You see a couple other ones. I think the free press has larger opposition than you might like to see, but it's
right.
Still, the right to keep and bear arms is the most controversial of the group of rights that they've laid out there. These sort of core things that are in our Bill of Rights, right? It's just an interesting poll, especially at a time like this where the country feels much more divided than it has been in previous decades. And we feel much more divided for a pretty long period of time. It's not just like the emergence of Donald Trump or Joe Biden's presidency or whatever. I think this goes back for quite a while. I mean, not that there was ever some kumbaya moment where everybody got along, but in our golden past or whatever, there were always divisions, and there always will be. But it feels like there's a new era of polarization and partisanship in the United States. I mean, we're at a point right now where the significant majority of the country doesn't want either one of the candidates. You're seeing it's much more common now, I think, for politicians especially presidents, to spend their entire terms underwater in terms of their approval rating and their favorabilities numbers. So, it's just one of those things where we have a lot of division, but even now, you can look to these core principles that Americans rely on, that they believe in, that really makes the country what it is. Has always been one of the things that was unique and best about the United States, is that it's founded on a set of ideals rather than, physical borders or the makeup of its people or what have you. Like, the American foundation is on this, these basic principles. This, you read the Declaration, you read the Constitution, you read the Bill of Rights. Those are the things that Americans stand for, that the country is built on, and it still holds true today, is what I take away from this poll.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a good point. Despite all the divisions, the fact that you still see 78% on something as controversial as guns, they still say that's valuable to the American identity or part of the American identity. I think that does say something, even in these times. Yeah. Heading into some of the stories we wrote this week, this one's actually one of mine. We wrote up an interesting study out of Colorado where I think this is the first to my knowledge, and I believe the study authors said this as well, the first time that empirical researchers have actually tried to take a look at how the Second Amendment sanctuary movement has impacted the use of quote unquote red flag laws. So when Colorado passed its red flag law in 2019, that sort of coincided with the big spread of the Second Amendment sanctuary movement. And almost immediately, 37 of Colorado's 64 counties declared themselves sanctuary counties in opposition to this law in particular. And so what they found in looking at the first 3 years of Colorado's red flag law being in effect, where they were used and how often they were used, there's actually a pretty substantial difference between the sanctuary counties and the non-sanctuary counties, both in terms of how many times red flag laws were petitioned, how many times judges approved them, who was initiating the red flag petitions. It was far less likely to be law enforcement in the sanctuary counties. So it's interesting to actually have some data to show that there was an impact with the Second Amendment sanctuary movement.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes out of that study, because that's the top line, I think, right? That which is what you'd expect, right? There would be fewer of these petitions in places that are where the community has shown political opposition to the concept of this type of law. And of course, this also connects, I think, obviously back to the Club Q shooting, because that was a scenario where people had looked at the fact that there was no red flag order against that shooter. Now there was I feel like that was a situation where, because he had a standoff with police previously, and
right,
there were a lot
the
of
charges got dropped, and
it wasn't just that they didn't use this red flag law. There were a lot of other options that is similar to the main shooting that we wrote about last week. A lot of other ways that there could have been intervention here, and they're just not everyone followed through, and then that's how something like this can happen. But yeah, beyond the fact that you have this disparity between the different kinds of counties involved, whether they're sanctuary counties, Second Amendment sanctuary counties or not. Beyond that, what you do see is that those counties still use this law.
Right.
They weren't completely devoid of using of red flag orders, right? So that was another interesting thing. Is like, they're not as frequent, but they still occur. And they also, I guess, there was also a significant difference with who was initiating them, right?
Right. Yeah. So in the sanctuary counties, only 30% of the total petitions that were filed in those types of counties came from law enforcement, whereas it was closer to 78% in the other counties, which is interesting because at the time of the study, only law enforcement or a family member could be the ones to initiate a petition in Colorado. They've since expanded that to a whole host of other people, but those were outside of the scope of this study. So the fact that law enforcement were far less likely to be the ones initiating it, they hypothesize that that's probably a result of some of the red flag stuff, or the Second Amendment sanctuary stuff, rather. Just that the general culture of law enforcement, maybe they're under the impression that the county or proclamation that says they're a sanctuary prevents them from doing so, or perhaps they're already politically opposed to doing so. Right. And they noted anecdotally, actually, in a couple of the cases that they looked through, that in some of these Second Amendment sanctuary counties, officers were instead going for more civil protection orders, more thorough sort of civil restraining orders that are longer term, that result in disarming a person under that order. But it's also much more thorough. It can be permanent in some cases. It's almost like a civil commitment sort of a thing. Mm-hmm. And they also hypothesize that process might be why where some of the disparities come from.
Yeah, and that gets at another interesting point that you hear from a lot of gun rights advocates who oppose red flag laws, which is that, a red flag order, all it does is take away your firearms for, this temporary period of time. It doesn't address anything else. And that's one of the common complaints with these sorts of policies, is that if this person is actually a danger to themselves or others, you should be using something more serious, like the civil commitment orders, or like these civil orders that you're referring to here. And so, that might be part of why it is the way it is. Of course, advocates of red flag laws, their counter to that is usually that it's much harder to get those other orders, of course, and that red flag orders are something of like a stopgap between doing nothing and like a full on mental health commitment. So but it's interesting to see that at play, and maybe law enforcement in these sanctuary counties are more of the idea that if they're going to do something drastic, like take somebody's guns away, that it better be a situation where there's evidence that they can use for a more serious order. But I mean, that's somewhat fascinating. And, at the same time, even though there aren't a lot of law enforcement initiated red flag orders, it seems like they still are at least accepting and processing ones from family members who use them. Although there was a difference as well in how frequently the orders were actually granted by a judge, right?
Yeah. So in the sanctuary counties, they found less than half the time a judge was actually approving these orders, whereas it was closer, I think, again, to like in the low 70 percentage point realm for the non-sanctuary counties. So once again, they sort of it's tough to parse through the data. They didn't offer too many strong conclusions one way or another, but they suggest it's potentially the political climate in those counties. But you could also counter and say, well, maybe non-sanctuary counties are being too liberal in how they authorize these orders. It's tough to say. That more study would be needed to dive into that. But it is interesting.
Another common critique that you'll hear that one of the concerns that are raised about red flag orders is that that judges will just kind of rubber stamp them because they don't want to be the judge who didn't issue one of these orders, and then the person does something terrible. And so I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to see that dichotomy in the different counties. Like, certainly, it could, like you said, we don't know exactly why the rates are the way they are. We can so this is really just speculation. They speculated a little bit in their study, but they called for more research. And I don't think they list out anything to do with sort of reasonings that judges have used to approve or deny these orders. But it may be that judges in sanctuary counties, there's obviously a cultural divide between sanctuary counties and non-sanctuary counties, I would say, in Colorado and in most states. It tends to follow the rural urban divide pretty closely. And there's a different view on firearms generally as well that tends to occur, between rural and urban areas, more conservative and more liberal areas. That's just, I think, the practical breakdown. And perhaps judges in the sanctuary counties are more concerned about the rights of the person being brought up for an order, a red flag order, whereas a judge in a more liberal area may be more concerned about the risk to the community, presented by this person. Now, I don't think it's going to be a cut and dry, obvious. They're going to always be opposite stereotypical outcome sort of thing, but it just does show up in the numbers a bit, and maybe that's why. We don't know, again, but that's one possibility at least.
Certainly. Either way, it's an interesting study. It's sort of a nice little look into how this actually played out when we saw the political backlash. We actually have some numbers to put to it. And like you said, I think the big takeaway is it confirms a little bit of the fears of red flag proponents, the fact that they are being used less often in these counties. But it also, I think, cuts against the gun rights position too, because their resistance clearly wasn't absolute. They're still finding reasons to use them. So interesting.
Yeah, certainly. They still happen, not as frequently. And I doubt that the differences over why people feel this is a good or bad policy is going to change much after this study, but
sure,
it is interesting to see the real world impact.
And then the final story we want to talk about today from us is one you had about the latest data on gun sales. We just got the updated March numbers, and sort of an interesting finding. We have another month of declining year over year gun sales. If you want to tell us a little bit more about what we found in the data.
Yeah, it's the third month in a row. So the first 3 months of 2024 all saw gun sales declines. And this came, the last time we reported on gun sales was back in the beginning of January. And the news then was that the last 3 months of 2023 had all seen year over year sales increases. And so we thought, okay, here's the evidence that the gun industry, the market, has found the new floor. It's been declining since the all-time highs of 2020 and 2021. And now, the industry, the market's been searching for that demand floor. And here we are, right? Look, last 3 months of 2023, we're starting to see increases over the last 3 months of 2022. And so we're going into an election year that usually drives sales up, and you'd expect those year over year increases to continue, not necessarily to get back to the 2020 levels. I don't think anyone expects that to happen this year without some sort of chaotic situation unfolding, which hopefully won't happen. Right? We don't, as much as you might want increased gun sales, if you're in the industry, you don't want another year like 2020 and all the stuff that, all the things that went wrong in order to get that, right? But you would still, I think, expect generally gun sales to increase during the election year, especially an election year that features the incumbent president running on a platform of instituting an assault weapons ban if he wins, right? That's his main marquee gun policy. It was the thing he highlighted in his State of the Union speech. He has not backed down at all from that. As we've talked about on the show before, he is committed to probably the most aggressive gun control platform that a Democratic presidential candidate has run on since at least Clinton, who actually passed an assault weapons ban, right? So you would expect that to lead to a bump in sales, and it hasn't. Instead, we're seeing declines. March was down, I believe, 7%, over 7% from the previous March. So it's rather fascinating. That doesn't seem like the market has actually found the floor yet.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. And the industry, and you quoted them in your piece, they're pointing to at least the fact that sales were over 1 million again. So it was 1.4 million, I believe, in March. And that's a continued trend for about 5 years now. So they're saying that, that's the floor. It's the fact that there's over 1 million a month every single month for the last 5 years. But to your point, we're seeing this wild oscillation where at the end of last year, you started to see, it's ticking back up again at the beginning of this year in an election year, when, like you said, all common indications would be this is when you're going to start to see it ramp up even more. The fact that it's slumping, I think, is a little bit fascinating, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Do you think it's maybe people are not quite tuned into the election yet? Do you think it's something else? I'm curious what to make of that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to have a members piece on this in the newsletter tomorrow. But yeah, first of all, like the March numbers actually put it below pre-pandemic levels. So, the fact that there were over 1 million sold in the month, and again, this is all based off of background check analysis. We don't have we don't have a perfect analog for actual gun sales in the United States. We have the FBI's National Criminal Instant Background Check System, NICS, that is a reliable indicator. It's the most reliable that we have, because any licensed dealer, when they make a commercial sale, the buyer has to go through a NICS check. And so the FBI at the end of every month puts out their report on how many NICS checks they did. Of course, there's a lot of factors that go into that, including it doesn't capture every gun sale. There's no national gun registry, so you can't know for sure how many were actually sold. Private sales, for instance, on the used market in the vast majority of states there's no NICS check required for those. So you don't capture any of those sales. You can also have multiple guns sold on a single NICS check. A lot of states allow you to use your concealed carry permit in lieu of doing a NICS check, because when you get the permit, there's a NICS check done on you at that time, which also leads into the other caveat about NICS numbers, is the fact that the raw numbers, if you just looked at how many NICS checks there were in a month, you would not get a good idea of how many gun sales there were, because permit checks are included in there, and several other kinds of checks. And some states will recheck your permit every single month. Illinois does that, which adds millions, hundreds of thousands of extra checks to the list. So the National Shooting Sports Foundation is the industry group that you're referring to here. They do an analysis that, the FBI's numbers come out and they code them. They say, these were for handguns, these were for long guns, these were permit checks, so on and so forth. And NSSF takes in that report and then tries to narrow it down to just gun sales, NICS checks for gun sales, and that's where we get that 1.4 million number. The reason I'm not super impressed by the fact that it was over 1 million last month is, again, 2024 was below not just all of the pandemic era months, Marches, but also below 2018 and 2013. Now, those were significant years of large gun sales, but at the same time, like it's not a good sign for the industry and for the market that you're still seeing declines, and that March. Excuse me. Oh my gosh, sorry. That the numbers are now falling back below 2019, 2018 pre-pandemic era. So millions of people bought guns for the first time during 2020, right? And you would expect that the sales levels would remain elevated beyond that. But that's usually what happens. You get a spike, then things come down, but the new floor is higher than the pre-spike numbers were. And that's what the danger is with this. Now, it's just 1 month, right? You want to make too much out of it. I think the 3 months being down compared to 2023 is a bad sign for the market. It is still a bit early, right, for election concerns to be driving a lot of sales, perhaps. You might see sales pick up as we get closer to the election and people start paying more attention. I think that's part of it. You can kind of look at news coverage. The amount of attention being paid to the news. You look at cable ratings or you look at website traffic, and they're way down compared to like 2020. Again, 2020 is not, you wouldn't expect news attention to the news to be as high as it was in March of 2020 for extremely obvious reasons, or April of 2020, because those were the lockdowns and the virus was spread, all this stuff was going on and the election was happening. We don't have those same factors this year, but at the same time, news coverage is attention to news is down. You're not even getting a bump from 2023, and that's surprising. And I think there's similar motivations behind that, which is people are not paying very much attention to the election yet at this stage. And so maybe they're not expecting, maybe there's not at top of mind any concerns about, gun bans or whatever, or, there's obviously with this election, things are, as we talked about earlier, people are very divided and very concerned, and there's concern about either one of these guys becoming president. I think that could drive people to buy firearms, and so maybe to some degree it's a good sign, right, that people aren't arming up in anticipation of a fallout from the election. Now, it's one thing to arm up because or buy guns because you're worried they might get banned. It's another thing to buy guns because you're worried there might be political violence, right? And so, at least as an chaos indicator, which gun sales can be, things are relatively low, which is that you could look at that as a good sign. Not a great sign for the gun market, the industry, but maybe a good sign societally at the moment. People aren't running out to the gun store. And then, of course, this is all still hangover, right, from those record sales levels. That's definitely part of it too. I think like the people who would be so concerned about the 2024 election that they would go out and buy a gun for the first time, right? Those people probably bought guns in 2020, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
If your motivation is this election is going to be so bad that I need to go out and get a gun, just in case some crazy thing happens, well, I'm pretty sure that person already bought a gun in 2020,
right?
Because they're probably 2020 already met that threshold of like, if I'm ever going to buy a gun, it's going to be now. Right. So, yeah, but at the same time, like you being lower than 2023's numbers, that's what's really concerned. Being lower than 2020's numbers, yeah, that's, I think everyone expect that. Being lower than 2023's numbers, that's a bad sign for the market and for the industry.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we'll be keeping an eye on it as we get closer, excuse me, to the election and see if maybe we do see the typical spike, or if this is just a sign of people being tuned out or fatigued or already armed. But we'll stay on top of that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors. I don't know. It's not, we're not going to get one perfect answer, but it's just an unexpected thing, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. But you were talking off air about some interesting stuff you got going on this weekend, where you actually have an event where you're going to help take people to the range. If you want to tell the listeners.
Yeah, tomorrow. The reason that we're doing this first broken out news update podcast on Thursday instead of Friday is that tomorrow I'm going to be doing a range day with the Young Americas Foundation with their National Journalism Center. I do this every year, a couple times a year, where we take their journalism interns to the range, give them a safety instruction, give them firearms policy and news instruction, try to give them a base level of understanding in case they ever report on the issue, and then actually take them to the range to have them actually fire some guns. Similar to what we, the first story we talked about, where the reporter actually went out and shot some guns to get a better idea about the topic that he was reporting on. That's basically what this program is designed to do for journalism interns at NJC. And it's always a good time. I'm looking forward to it very much. One of my favorite things to do each year. I get to speak to college classes fairly regularly. Was up in Columbia University not that long ago in New York, talking to a class there. But this event's, I think, even better because I get to actually take these kids to the range and have them actually experience shooting firearms. So, I think that gives them an extra level of understanding, which is always helpful when you're going to be, I think if you're reporting on anything, you don't have to be a professional basketball player to be a good commentator, but you probably should have shot a basketball at a net before. You know what I mean?
Right.
Similar idea here, I think. You don't need to be a gun owner or collector or expert marksman to accurately report on firearms, but you probably should have some familiarity with guns. And so that's what we're hoping to instill. And so I'm looking forward to that tomorrow. Speaking of basketball, by the way, I was actually at the Wizards-Lakers game last night in DC, which was a lot of fun. My girlfriend loves LeBron. She's from the Philippines originally, and basketball is like huge there, the NBA in particular. So she loves LeBron, and there's actually a lot of Filipinos in the NBA. I think one of the top coaches is a Filipino guy. But so there's a whole cultural thing in the Philippines around the NBA. But she'd never seen LeBron in person before, so we went. It was very expensive, to be honest with you. I get LeBron and Lakers going anywhere. I think it's just going to be expensive to get in.
Yep.
Like I'm going to the Phillies game tomorrow and Saturday, and I get those tickets for like $20. And the Lakers tickets, not even close to that. But it was a good time. That was fun. She had a great time seeing him, so I enjoyed it a lot. And she's coming with me to the Phillies tomorrow, so it's a bit of a trade-off.
I say, there you go. You get to take her to see LeBron, and then she has to go with you to watch the Phillies.
Yeah, although she also loves the Phillies and Philly sports outside of the lake, outside of basketball.
Nice.
So it works out well. But I'm looking forward to doing that, and then also to this range day tomorrow. Plus, I just I get to shoot myself, to shoot at the range myself, and it's for free.
Any excuse to do that is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have to pay for the ammo, so that's another bonus. In fact, they pay me to do it, so that's
a win-win.
Ask for much more.
Absolutely.
Than that. So I'm gonna be, I think, shooting that my macro some more to work with that optic that I put on it, the Sealy, and see how well that holds up. It's been going pretty good so far. But
I say you'll have to give us an update about that next week's episode.
Yeah, and maybe they'll have an H9 there I can try. And
there you go.
We'll see if it has all the problems that we've been hearing about. But I don't know. That's yeah. It's looking good. You got any plans?
Nothing in stone yet. Actually, your story about the range day did remind me. I have a friend that just became a first-time gun owner. I took him shooting. Actually, it was part of a bachelor party for another friend about a year ago, and he really enjoyed himself. And he'd been looking for a while, and he finally got his first handgun. And so we're going to try to see if nothing's confirmed yet, but I'm going to try to see if we can get him out to shoot his brand new gun. So I'm looking forward to that if that happens. So maybe I'll have an update for the listeners next week on how that went. But
wonderful. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got for this week. If you want to sign up for our free newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America, you can head over to reload.com and do that. Of course, if you want to get a deeper insight into what's happening, you can buy a membership and you'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you will not find anywhere else. You'll also get access to the weekly Reload podcast, the interview podcast, which comes out on Mondays for everybody else, but members get access to that on Sunday. This week we have actually Matt LaRosa, the gun rights. I'm pretty sure I said his name wrong there, but you'll hear it right on the podcast on Sunday if you're a member. Who he wrote that piece for us on arguing that the ruling in that federal case that said that the nonviolent, undocumented immigrant, illegal, whatever you want to call them, it's a person who was in the United States unlawfully. They'd been arrested for having a gun. Their conviction was thrown out. We talked about this a little while back. And he wrote that piece for us on why he agreed with the ruling and thinks that that's the proper interpretation of Bruen. So we're going to go in depth on that because I think there was a lot of interest in that. And maybe we'll have Kostas Moros, who wrote the sort of countervailing view on at a future date as well, because I think it's a fascinating topic and really gets into the ins and outs of Bruen and the philosophical foundations of gun rights and things of that nature. So yeah, that's going to be the main interview, and that's what you'll get early access to. If you're a Reload member, you also have the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment if you'd like. So check out those membership options today over at thereload.com. But yeah, that's all we've got for you guys. We'll see you again real soon.